It is so good to talk about Jesus. Are you ready for the word today?
Yes.
All right, I want to share with you something that the Lord began to put on my spirit a few weeks ago. I've been doing a series on my podcast of looking at Old Testament stories through New Covenant lens, taking an examination of Old Testament texts of scriptures, chapters, verses, stories, highlights, and then putting on my lens of what I know happens to that through Christ and His finished work. Because when Jesus dies on the cross, resurrects from the dead and ascends to the Father, then descends into the church at Pentecost. That part always gets left out for some reason too. We talk about Christ died, was buried, raised, and and we always put Him seated at the right hand of the Father. But I think we skip Pentecost where He shows up in His church through the Holy Spirit and hasn't went anywhere since. Still living in us. And since He lives in us, and we believe that changes the way our eyes work. Because when we open them as new creations with Christ in us, the hope of glory. So therefore, we don't look at Old Testament scriptures as we would as if we didn't have Christ in us. We look at Old Testament scriptures as you would if you had Christ in you, and realizing my Christ has already come to affect that story. My Christ has already come, in some cases, to fulfill that story. I would even argue that a lot of things we're putting out in our future going, won't it be wonderful when Christ does that? That I think Christ has already done that and will do that in us if we'll open our eyes through that lens. So as I walked through those Old Testament stories, I got into one of my favorite Old Testament books, the book of Zechariah. And in Zechariah, there are highlights of prophetic voices, stuff that happens that preludes Jesus. There's fantastic moments in Zechariah that can't be fulfilled until the cross. Jesus tells His disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane, the shepherd is going to be smitten and the sheep are going to scatter. And that happens at Calvary. Where'd that come from? Zechariah. Their Old Testament prophecy of someday I'm going to let you out of the covenant, Israel, and you're going to tell me what it's worth to you. And when you tell me what it's worth to you, I'll snap my covenant and we won't have to have covenant anymore. And what's it worth to you? And they counted out to me 30 pieces of silver. And then we get Judas Iscariot bringing 30 pieces of silver and buying out Jesus. And where's that prophecy? Zechariah. Zechariah is loaded with these prescient moments of what's coming in Jesus. So if we watch for Him, we don't wait till Matthew to find Jesus. We find Jesus there. We just have to watch through that lens of a finished work. And then we can let that story inform stories that Jesus tells. Now, a lot of times we get in trouble with Jesus stories because we're reading them and we're not reading them from the point of view of a Jew who had an Old Testament as their foundation. So we're hearing Jesus tell stories, and we might be missing the parallels because we're not thinking Old Testament storytelling time. And all He's doing with parables is laying another layer on top of what they already knew from the Old Testament. I bet a lot of us have never looked at parables that way. We look at them as earthly stories with a heavenly meaning. That's a shoddy definition. It's actually, I'm going to give you a very simple agrarian story that has to do with your 40-hour work week so that you can better understand something you learned in church. Something you learned in Proverbs or Psalms or Zechariah. And then these stories will come alive. And the problem is that we don't really know Psalms and Proverbs and Isaiah and Zechariah. And therefore those parables kind of get lost on us and we're filtering them through a misunderstanding. So what I want to do today is I want to start with the Zechariah story. And then I want to go grab a Jesus parable and lay it on top of that foundation. And I think you'll put those glasses on with me, that New Covenant lens. And when you put those New Covenant lenses on, that Old Testament story starts to shift. It'll be an amazing thing where it starts to have a meaning it couldn't have without Jesus, and that it'll never have again. Because you've already have Jesus in here, and therefore that story gets filtered through what we understand of Him.